I'm Kathy Manning. I'm honored to serve as the board chair of Democratic Majority for Israel at this critical time. This week, we saw the ceasefire agreement advance in Israel as Israel and Egypt reopened the Rafah border crossing. Meanwhile, diplomatic talks are expected to take place tomorrow between Iran's foreign minister and President Trump's advisors in an effort to de-escalate tensions. There is no shortage of news to discuss, and I'm so grateful that we've convened two distinguished speakers to share their insights. Before I introduce them, a reminder, please consider following us on social media. We are on X, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, LinkedIn, and Blue Sky. You can sign up for our news and updates on our website at dmfi.org. If you want to ask a question, please submit it through the Q&A feature on your Zoom interface. If you're watching on Facebook, you can enter in the comments section. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce our distinguished speakers for today. Ambassador Dennis Ross is the Counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He has played a leading role in shaping U.S. involvement in the Middle East peace process and in dealing directly with the parties in negotiations for more than 12 years. A highly skilled diplomat, Ambassador Ross was U.S. point man on the peace process in both the George H.W. Bush and the Bill Clinton administrations. He was instrumental in assisting Israelis and Palestinians to reach the 1995 interim agreement. He also successfully brokered the 1997 Hebron Accord. He facilitated the 1994 Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty and intensively worked to bring Israel and Syria together. Prior to returning to the Institute in 2011, he also served 2 years as Special Assistant to President Obama and National Security Council Senior Director for the Central Region, and a year as Special Advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. Ambassador Ross has written many books on the peace process and the Middle East and international relations. Most recently, he co-authored Be Strong and of Good Courage, How Israel's Most Important Leaders Shaped Its Destiny, with his colleague David Makovsky. We'll also hear from Jacob Magid, the U.S. Bureau Chief for the Times of Israel. Jacob oversees the paper's coverage of American policy, Jewish community affairs, and U.S.-Israel relations. He earlier served as the newspaper's settlements correspondent, reporting intensively on West Bank developments and regional politics. Ambassador Ross, why don't you start us off with your observations on these pressing issues? Then we'll hear from Jacob Magid. After we hear from our speakers, our Chief Policy Officer, Rachel Bombach, will lead us in the Q&A session. And finally, at the conclusion of the conversation, our DMFI CEO and President, Brian Romick, will share some remarks. Ambassador Ross, over to you.
All right, thanks, Kathy. Good to be with you. I'll try to speak for, I guess, 5 to 10 minutes so that Jacob has a shot, and then we have time for everybody to ask questions. I think the obvious place to start is, are we going to have a war with Iran? And I'll try to put this in some context. I actually have a book I did this year called Statecraft 2.0, in which there's one of the chapters is on Iran, and I went through every administration's policy from Jimmy Carter to today and what tended to affect the Iranians. Why am I mentioning this? One of the key things that has shaped the Iranian approach towards us is to avoid a war, a direct war with us. And this goes back to the late 1988, when we reflagged ships at a time during the Iran-Iraq War when Iran decided that it would try to stop Iraq from being able to export its oil. We reflagged tankers. The result of reflagging the tankers was we ended up sinking a good chunk of the Iranian Navy, their oil platforms, and inadvertently shot down a civilian airliner, which was inadvertent on our part. They assumed it was not. At the time, the prime minister of Iran was Mousavi, who today is under house arrest, went to Khomeini and said, look, we can't continue this. This could collapse the regime. The president at that time was Khomeini, and one of the lessons he drew was don't get into a direct shooting war with the United States. We've seen Iran twice, after the killing of Soleimani and after the 12-day war. Each time hit a target, but they telegraphed in advance to us what they were going to do, which was their way of signaling, we're just doing this, and if you don't do anything, we can stop. Now, we're in a somewhat different circumstance, not because they like the prospect of dealing with a direct war with us, because the most important priority has always been regime survival. The problem right now is Khamenei is likely to look at what we are saying the negotiations are about. An end to any enrichment on the nuclear issue, limitation on the numbers of ballistic missiles and the ranges they can have, an end to material support for their proxies, and reducing the oppression of their people. Khamenei is going to look at that as if, well, that's regime change. So the issue becomes, if the regime's at stake anyway, the fact that they may have killed, we know they killed at least 6,000 people, and some estimates are as high as 30,000 in 2 days, by the way. It's stunning, the level, really, it's a kind of a massacre that they carried out, which is they'll go to any lengths to protect the regime. If they think this is about regime survival, then their view is they don't have a lot to lose. The fact that they're willing to talk indicates that they're not rushing to get into a war with us. But the fact that they negotiated, or I shouldn't say negotiated, they imposed where this would be, and they're trying to say they'll talk only about the nuclear issue, thinks that they can somehow affect Trump. They read President Trump as someone who wants to do one and done. He wants to use force quickly, decisively, and stop it. If they want to create an impression, that's not going to happen. They have people from the region, a number of our friends from the region, have gone to the president and basically said, you know, we don't want to see the war erupt in a kind of a broader regional conflict, and we think there's a danger. So he went along, which I would have, if I were giving advice, and I gave this advice to the Biden administration, why does anyone let the Iranians determine the form of the negotiations and the location of the negotiations? You know, these were supposed to take place in Turkey, others might participate. Suddenly the Iranians say, no, it has to be in Oman and only with the US. We should have said, look, this is what you originally agreed to, we're not changing, and then hold out. We didn't do that. We've already conceded something in that regard. And the message it sends is a combination of us and from the region, that the region is still fearful that there could be a war and that the Iranians could be driving it. That's not going to make them more likely to agree to something. Now, having said everything I've just said, I don't know that President Trump will stick to the idea that he has to have this whole agenda covered. What if the Iranians come back and they basically say, all right, we'll meet you on the nuclear issue. By the way, I think it's not impossible to get them to agree to a long-term suspension of any uranium enrichment. They're not enriching right now because of the effects of the 12-day war. Even though they say they won't discuss the other issues, the idea of saying, okay, there'll be some limitations on ballistic missiles and ranges and sizes, I'm not sure that's impossible. Stopping their support for their proxies, they can say, well, we'll treat them as political actors, not as military ones. In other words, if they're really interested in coming up with an agreement, I suspect they will be able to influence Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. If they are going to hang tough, then we may be in a different place. The indicator I will look for is there an agreement to have a follow-on meeting? Now, there could be an indication of disinformation, because there was some disinformation before the June war. But I would bet that if there's an agreement for a follow-on meeting, it's because they have discussed a framework for ongoing negotiations. It certainly could be in the Iranian interest to play for time and just hope that the process itself creates a different set of incentives. Where Trump has some credibility is, he said in the negotiations back in the spring, you got 60 days, and on day 61, the Israelis began the strikes. So I'm going to be looking for, fundamentally, is there an announcement at the end of this that there'll be follow-on discussions the time and location also being announced, or at least an indication that will come quickly. If that's the case, then we're looking at a negotiating process. It doesn't rule out there might still be a conflict, but it at least reduces, I think, the prospect, A, that there'll be one, or at least that there'll be one anytime soon. I could go on the Gaza issue, but why don't I stop there so that Jacob has a chance to speak, and then we'll take it from there.
Great, thank you. Jacob, we may come back to you on the Gaza issue. Jacob.
All right, so then I'll just also only speak about Iran. I can't speak as authoritatively regarding the history as Dennis can, but I'll just make some points about what I've been hearing from several diplomats I've been speaking to over the past 24 hours. And it was interesting. I spoke with one senior Gulf diplomat who said that there's basically unanimity of understanding amongst other countries in the region, not including Israel, that a strike by the U.S. would not necessarily carry out the desired effect, that there's concern that it would simply embolden hardliners in the region, hardliners in Iran, mainly in the IRGC. And I guess this was one of the main points that I think they were pushing to convince the Trump administration to walk back on its plans to hold these talks in Turkey, and just agree to what Iran was pushing for in Oman. And it seems like at times that these Gulf diplomats have had an effective strategy in convincing Trump to maybe walk back a little bit, when at times he seemed closer to carrying out a strike, mainly last month towards the beginning of the month when Trump, it seemed like we were really close. I think it's interesting that the Gulf countries that are speaking with Trump are also trying to leave Israel out of these negotiations. I think they see Israel as, in their minds, a spoiler that's seeking to encourage President Trump to strike Iran, and it's something that they just simply aren't supportive of at this point. I know there was a report from I think it was Axios about KBS, the Saudi Crown Prince's brother and defense minister, talking about basically almost goading Trump and saying, actually, if you don't strike, that it'll be emboldening Iran. I think my understanding is the remarks were more nuanced than that, and I think he was speaking more analytically and just the importance of having a strategy, because I think that hasn't really been clarified by the administration what the exact strategy is, and if they do make their 4 points about they want no nuclear and the enrichment removed from the country, the enriched uranium stockpiles removed, and proxies and missiles, but I think how a strike would actually advance that goal hasn't really been clarified, and I think that's what I think those pushing back against it are raising. But at the same time, I think they don't want to be seen as coming out against the U.S. and coming out against Trump, and therefore maybe that kind of explains those remarks from KBS to try to be getting ahead of the U.S. if they understand that the U.S. is going to be moving forward anyway. But I think given this decision to play along with the Iranians after I think there had been some sort of agreement regarding holding talks in Turkey, and just accepting the Iranian switch of venue, indicates that maybe the U.S. is recognizing that because Trump wants this just to be a one and done strike, and not a dragged out war, that maybe it's not so clear that they're able to do that at this stage. Maybe it's playing for time and trying to get more assets in the region. There's continuously reports of more and more aircraft carriers that somehow keep floating towards the region, and maybe it's also playing a role in the decision to allow Iran to buy for time, it seems.
Thank you. Dennis, before we open up for questions, you want to talk about Gaza?
Sure. Look, the phase 2 has begun. The essence of phase 2 is disarmament for reconstruction, and the IDF withdrawal. The IDF withdrawal from the yellow line. You have 2 zones in Gaza. The red zone is 47% and controlled by Hamas. Israel is 53%, and that's the green zone. this is really the crux of the matter. I mean, one would never, phase one was crucial because it produced the release of all the hostages. Maybe not exactly on the timeline that had been agreed, but in the end it happened. And there isn't anybody I know in Israel from the top political and security establishment who had assumed that you'd get all the hostages out. So that leads them to say, okay, we'll give the Trump administration the benefit of the doubt for a while, though there is nobody that I've talked to in Israel who believes that Hamas will actually go along with a serious disarmament process. The people in the administration, starting with the president, said just a few days ago that he's optimistic that Hamas is going to disarm. I think that they are hearing, Witkoff and Kushner are hearing from the Turks and the Qataris, and Witkoff actually deals directly with Hamas. I think they're believing what they're hearing, that in fact Hamas is prepared to go along with a decommissioning process. I believe that it's possible to put the right kind of pressure on Hamas. They will not do this willingly. I mean, Hamas is an Arabic abbreviation for Islamic resistance movement. Their identity is resistance. They reject the existence of Israel. They reject the idea that they would give up armed resistance. So the idea that they're going to disarm voluntarily, even though it's point 13 of the Trump 20 points, I think is an illusion. But it doesn't mean that you can't create a context where, in fact, there's enormous pressure on them. And because of that pressure, and it is political and they're isolated, it can be economic, and it can also be military, the threat of Israeli military force. All those three things, in my mind, could make it likely that they will begin a process of decommissioning. The most important thing, I regret that the Board of Peace that was created wasn't created at the time that the Security Council resolution was adopted, 2803. What is most important within Gaza is for the Gazans themselves to see there's an alternative to Hamas. Hamas has used the time since the ceasefire to entrench itself further, to act very quickly to prove there's no other one in charge but them, to use the weapons they have to coerce the public. But if you create for that public at a time when I'm quite convinced, based on a lot of things I see in social media, based on the fact that there's an Arabic-based platform called Jasur that has had more than 200 hits, and if you go on their website and look at the interviews they've been doing, it's all Arabic-based with people in Gaza. Over 20 million hits of these interviews, and they show overwhelmingly opposition to Hamas. So if you can make it safe enough for people to feel that they can oppose Hamas, if you create a sense that there is a clear alternative and it's going to be backed, and if you create the beginning of a process of disarmament because you have isolated Hamas, and the onus is on them. One of my big complaints about the approach of the Israeli government was it kept the onus on Israel, not on Hamas. And one of the reasons is the way it treated humanitarian assistance. It cut it off at times. And that put all the pressure and all the focus on Israel, not on Hamas. Now, if you now have an issue that reconstruction can actually begin, but it's not going to happen unless there's disarmament. So it becomes clear, you want to transform Gaza, you want to recover in Gaza, you want to have a future in Gaza for the people who desperately need it. Hamas has to be prepared to live up to what it says it was committing to, which was the Trump peace plan. They said they embraced it, and point 13 is very explicit, not just about the decommissioning of weapons, but also the destruction of the tunnels, the provision of maps of the tunnels and the destruction of the tunnels, where Hamas basically built up, produced, and stored its weapons. If you're serious about disarmament, that's what you're going to have to address. I'll say one last thing. The Board of Peace is one thing. Its executive board, which happens to have Turkey and Qatar on it over the opposition of Prime Minister Netanyahu, but it also has a high representative, Nikolai Mladenov, who is the single best person I've worked with in the UN system by orders of magnitude. And the reason is because he he could work with all sides, including the Israelis. That was rarely the case of most of the UN officials. He's fluent in Arabic. He grew up in the region. He deals with all sides. He understands the nature of the problem. He can work with all the key players. And to be successful here, you're going to have to do what I did an article with my colleague, David Makovsky, in Foreign Affairs this week. You're going to have the president apply real leverage to Turkey and Qatar so they deliver on pressuring Hamas. They help to isolate it, make clear the consequence that it will be isolated and the consequences of that. And at the same time, be prepared to put pressure on Bibi, because Bibi will be There is an alternative. That the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza is 15 Palestinians, technocrats, some of whom I know, who are credible people. And you need to ensure they begin to deliver the goods on the ground quickly as a way of building their authority. You build their authority, you build their credibility. That also raises the price to Hamas of trying to stop them. Here, I think you have the potential, but it's going to take a very consistent effort. It's going to require a realistic view of what's happening. It's going to require an approach to the decommissioning that is time-based, meaning there could be a deadline for it. It needs to have a series of phases also of what's going to happen and where it's going to happen. No reconstruction. What the approach of the Board of Peace and of Mladic is no reconstruction in the red zone unless you can have it begin in those places where the decommissioning, disarmament, and action against tunnels has begun. Otherwise, you'll see it only in the green zone. And you have to understand, I said 47% of the area of Gaza is controlled by Hamas. Over 95% of the population is in the red zone. 95% is basically a low estimate. I understand it's about 30,000 out of 2 million people. 30,000 Palestinians are in the Israeli control zone. The rest of the 2 million are in the red zone. And there's no easy capacity to be moving people from red to green anytime soon. So meaningful reconstruction isn't going to take place in the red zone without disarmament. You're not really going to be addressing the needs of people unless you can do that. There is, and this is my last point, there is an approach that is interesting and promising. There have been 4,200 trucks a week that have been going into Gaza. The majority of those are actually doing commercial, not humanitarian, basically commercial goods. Hamas has been taxing that. The plan right now is to have most of the trucks go into the red zone carrying only humanitarian assistance, so it can't be taxed. There are Palestinian police who are going to be brought in. They will be responsible for helping to distribute this. And the more that can be done quickly in that regard, you'll immediately build up the authority of the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, because they'll be seen as delivering the goods at a time when Hamas cannot and will not be able to. Stop there.
Dennis, let me ask you one question before we go back to Jacob. Can you help us understand what would the decommissioning look like?
Basically, this is a good question, because you don't have the International Stabilization Force. The original conception was the International Stabilization Force would preside over this, but there's nobody who signed up to be part of it that wants to be actively disarming Hamas. So this is probably a case of creating locations where you'll have weapons turned over, probably to Palestinian police who've been trained by the Jordanians and the Egyptians. They're supposed to be backed up by the ISF. There are 2 countries that have committed to joining the ISF. They haven't been announced yet. The rules of engagement and the mandate have not yet been finalized. So there's a lot of uncertainty about that. But basically, you're talking about something where weapons are turned over to Palestinian police. Then the question is, so what happens to them? Are they destroyed, or do they go to a warehouse? Who controls the warehouse? There are more unanswered questions than answers to those questions. But you ask, what is the critical point? Because even if they're turning over the weapons, if they can go back and seize them again, you haven't gained anything. But I would say, one of the parallel pieces of this is they have to turn over maps of where all the tunnels are, and then there has to be a plan presented for destruction of tunnels. And I'll just say, even in the area that Israel controls, the 50%, the 53%, Israel has only dismantled or destroyed half of the tunnels. So there's still a lot that needs to be done. And Hamas, as I said, has entrenched itself significantly since the time of the ceasefire.
Thank you. Jacob, back to you. You want to comment on Gaza?
Yeah, I think the Trump administration had an unprecedented victory in November with the Security Council resolution that Dennis mentioned, which basically just gave it carte blanche to control Gaza through the board of peace for the next 2 years till the end of 2027. And yes, it's a board of peace, but really, if you look at the charter and how it's being put together, it's Trump is the one in control. And I think the U.S. still managed to get all these countries on board through the Security Council because I think it managed to do kind of what was seen as the impossible by getting this ceasefire deal in October and getting all the hostages out. So there was more goodwill there. I think still this desire to keep curry favor in the eyes of Trump, and you got countries to either abstain or back it. But then I think I spoke with one European diplomat who it's funny that he used this metaphor, but he said that the U.S. spiked the football a bit. Maybe spiked the soccer ball. But I think what he was referring to was what's happened in the past few weeks, which through the rollout of the actual board of peace, it wasn't even the Security Council resolution talks about board of peace before it was even formed. But basically, it's not about Gaza, at least if you look at the charter. It's just about they're trying to maybe usurp the UN in many ways, becoming this new preeminent global conflict resolution body. And I think the timing of this rollout, along with this fight over Greenland, I think really scared away or maybe emboldened a lot of European countries and Western countries from participating in this. I think they're no longer interested in trying to curry favor with Trump. And I think that maybe lost a little bit of momentum. One could argue that those countries aren't so critical anyway in this effort. I think the U.S., this Trump administration in particular, has looked elsewhere for support, and namely the Arab and Muslim world, and a lot of countries are. I think there's a bloc of 6 that agreed to join the Board of Peace. But also just with the rollout being quite confusing, just trying to cover it, there's all these different bodies. There's the executive board. Then there's the Gaza Executive Board, which is the one that Israel's upset about, and that was understood to be the board that was going to be the most important because it's the one actually dealing with Gaza. But then there was a resolution that the Trump administration handed to potential members in Davos that actually refers to the Gaza Executive Board as just an advisory body, which is how Netanyahu is trying to frame it to push back on some of the anger that he's been facing from his coalition and opposition partners over giving Qatar and Turkey a foothold in Gaza. So there's not a lot of clarity, but what you can see in all these different bodies is that the U.S. is the one really in control. Maybe they're going to be empowering Mladenov at some points by giving him this role of the high representative for Gaza. But ultimately, if you look at all these different committees, it's the U.S. is in charge, has like almost a majority, or Trump allies are a clear majority in all these different committees. They even added Susie Wiles to both the Gaza Executive Committee and the Executive Committee. So clearly, there's a desire to control everything that's moving forward with this process. I think we mentioned Nikolai's role here. It seems like it's going to be trying to put together a package for the NCAG, the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, this technocratic committee, to try to enter Gaza with some victories. And I think he's having a real hard time putting that package together because if you talk about the red zone and the green zone and how all of the Palestinians are in the red zone, that what's really needed right now is, even if we're not talking about full reconstruction, temporary housing, some of the maybe mobile homes or something of that sort, in addition to some more leniency on dual use items that Israel has been very strict about, arguing that it has to do with not allowing Hamas to co-opt some of these materials, turn them into weapons. But I think at this point, we're going on nearing 2.5 years of this system where Gazans are only being given basic humanitarian aid, and things like fresh fruit and vegetables have not really been going in large numbers. And that kind of diet over such an extended period of time is not something that is, maybe it's sustainable in the eyes of Israel. I don't think it's sustainable in the eyes of the humanitarian complex, I guess you could say. So I think there's efforts to try to ease some of these issues on humanitarian aid. But I think in an election year in Israel, there's very little willingness, I think, to budge on these issues. When it has to do with the red zone, because I think there's so much political toxicity with doing that, and the argument that this will be able to go to Hamas is so easily thrown around. We're seeing it now, right, with this investigation that's tied the brother of the Shin Bet chief, that was allegedly involved in smuggling, and the charge that he's being accused of is aiding the enemy, because if you're smuggling cigarettes into Gaza, that theoretically can reach Hamas, and that's how Hamas is able to boost its coffers. So I think that those arguments are going to continually hear. And it doesn't give a lot of room for the High Representative Nikolai Mladenov and others to try to maybe ease the humanitarian situation in Gaza a little bit more. But I think there is a lot of goodwill on his part to try to move forward, and I think he does have good ties with the U.S., with Israel and Hamas. But just the last thing I'll just say, I don't see a lot of room for optimism. The last 48 hours, there was this big hubbub about the logo of the NCAG, because the Technocratic Committee had a new logo that they put out when they started, and then a couple days ago they updated it to the one that's basically identical to the Palestinian Authority's logo. And that therefore the understanding or the accusation in Israel is that this is really just another PA body. We don't want the PA in Gaza. And I think U.S. officials spent basically the whole day negotiating with the different sides to try to come up with a solution to this. And ultimately, the NCAG put out a statement saying, well, the logo is not final. We'll see what happens. And it's possible it will be changed, but we'll be the ones to decide. We're sovereign here. But that's what we're arguing over, a logo, not real substance. And I think that it's going to be difficult to change that as the elections in Israel get closer.
And I just
Thank
add,
you.
I just want to add a point. Everything that Jacob said is right, but bear in mind the following. The Board of Peace, as you said, Jacob, quite correctly, doesn't even refer to Gaza in its charter, and is clearly designed to be a kind of alternative to the UN Security Council. If it can't succeed in Gaza, then it has no prospect anywhere else. So Trump has an enormous stake in making it succeed, precisely because of what he wants it to be, number one. Number two, Bibi has not shown a capacity to say no to Trump when it's important to Trump. And an election year doesn't make it easier for him. It puts him in a trap. Because if he's saying no to Trump, then he reduces what he really needs from Trump, which is a quasi, if not direct endorsement, because that actually could make a difference in the election. So Trump has a lot of leverage. The question becomes, will he use it? Now, we've seen him use it. Frankly, after the failed attack in Doha, he used it. And we saw it in a number of ways, not the least of which is forcing Bibi to call the Prime Minister of Qatar and apologize in the Oval Office, and getting him to sign off on the 20 points. The point 19 says if the Palestinian Authority faithfully carries out reform, that can create the path to self-determination and statehood for Palestinians. You can try to explain the language away, but it's there, and that's one of the selling points for the Arabs. So Trump signed on to it, and I'll just say, just again, from a point of historical reality, no American president has ever publicly embraced the concept of self-determination for Palestinians. Okay? Guess which president just did it? Donald Trump. So it depends on if he's going to stay engaged. My guess is whatever happens on Iran, his interest in making the Board of Peace work is going to go up, not down.
I just have to ask you, does Trump's adding the Palestinian-oriented news outlet to the White House press corps, is that a signal?
Could be. Could be. I think
Okay.
so. I think so.
I'm going to turn it over to Rachel for the Q&A. Thank you both for providing us with such great and important information. Rachel.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm delighted to moderate the Q&A portion of this program. A reminder, if you have a question, please submit it in the Q&A box on Zoom, or if you're watching on social media, type it into the comments section. So back to Iran. Since the protests there last month, there have been several threats made by President Trump, from sending unspecified help to the protesters to the prospect of regime change in Tehran. And since then, there's been a massive buildup of U.S. military assets in the Gulf. So Ambassador Ross, what do you see as the objectives of any potential U.S. military operation against Iran? What tools do you believe President Trump will deploy to achieve them? Do you believe kinetic strikes can achieve regime change? And Jacob, how is Israel viewing the negotiations? And would you expect Israel to get involved militarily if the U.S. strikes Iran first?
Okay, so you ask what is, I would say, the crucial question. When I write about statecraft, I say the essence of good statecraft is you marry your objectives and your means. Seems like it's obvious, right? Except we rarely seem to do it. Can anybody say clearly what our objective is vis-a-vis Iran right now with the buildup of force? I follow this pretty closely, and I can't tell you I know what the objective is. Is it regime change? Well, if it's regime change, you're not going to produce regime change only with air power. You'll actually have to have people on the ground. If it's not regime change, maybe it's regime degradation, so that it is weakened over time, and that makes its fall at some point more likely. As I said a little earlier, the more this regime in Iran feels its survival is at stake, the less it has to lose. So the question becomes, and this is one of the reasons I think those in the region feel they're going to end up being the targets. One of the reasons I think that the president, in a sense, got out in front of himself, because when he said help's on the way, he raised the expectation of people in Iran that we were going to intervene immediately. The problem was we weren't in a position to do it. We have bases in the area. We have 35 to 40,000 people in the area. We didn't have the defense assets in place to be able to protect our own bases. So now, to be fair, we have built up and we're in a much better position to provide for our own defense. When I look at the fact that the Saudi defense minister was here last week, he clearly had multiple purposes, but one of them was to come and find out, look, if you're going to do this, what are you going to do to protect us? Because we may be the ones who get hurt very quickly by this. The kind of coordination that needs to be done, I'm not sure how much has been done, but it comes back to the essence of the question. What are we trying to achieve? What is the objective? If it's all about squeezing the regime, you actually have other means that can do that. We could do more to shut off all their oil exports without doing it militarily. If we do it militarily, you're going to create the incentive for them to go after the oil facilities among the Saudis, Emiratis, and so forth. They will have more of an incentive to blockade the Straits of Hormuz, which mostly by mining it. But if they do that, that's also a suicide act on their part, because it means they're cutting off their own ability to export. So they are faced with bad choices. We are not necessarily faced with great choices. Is the purpose of this, if we do a strike, maybe it would be a limited strike just to say, we said if you suppress and kill your people the way you did, you will pay a price. All right, that objective could be, we forced them to pay a price. Everybody saw they had to pay a price because of what they did to their own public. Maybe that could be the objective. It doesn't seem like it's what the objective is, or maybe Trump is a big believer that you engage in coercion to get agreements, which, by the way, I happen to be a believer that there's no such thing as diplomacy without leverage. And leverage can be both positive and negative. Usually there has to be a coercive element so that those you're dealing with decide that it's too costly for them not to say yes, and then you give them a ladder or you give them some inducements that help them rationalize why they said yes. Is that part of what Trump has in mind? Maybe. I have a lot of, I lack the humility I should have when it comes to predicting what can happen in the Middle East. I have a lot of humility when it comes to predicting President Trump.
So you asked about how Israel might respond to an attack. My understanding, speaking to an Israeli official earlier this week, is that they're not interested in carrying out any strike unless attacked. That's been the talking point that I've heard in this briefing and other ones. I do think they have options on the table, but I think that for now is the approach. They're wanting the U.S. to lead this effort, and Prime Minister Netanyahu even said in a briefing with the Security Cabinet that he doesn't know what he's going to do. So that's kind of how Israel is looking at it. Just a couple other things that came to mind from both questions was, and I don't think I said this earlier, is that what the senior Gulf diplomat I spoke with said about one of the reasons why that they don't feel that a strike would be effective is because they feel right now that Iran is actually weak enough that they do see a possibility where it would agree to some sort of non-aggression pact with the U.S., which would cover, in addition to covering the nuclear issue and maybe shipping off some of the stockpiles, and even the regional proxy issue, because it's almost, you can make an argument even amongst hardliners that it's done more to harm Iran than actually help Iran, that policy. And you could actually see a rollback in some of that funding. This is how the Gulf, at least some of these Gulf countries see it, that they would be willing to, especially because they need the money domestically to maybe cut back on some of the funding abroad. And therefore, this non-aggression pact is what some of the people in the region think is realistic in these negotiations, as much as Iran is talking tough. But that is something that I was told was going to be part of the framework that was going to be put forward if the talks were held in Turkey. Now that they're in the U.S., now that they're going to be in Oman, and it's just with the parties themselves, the U.S. and Iran, and not these other countries, it's unclear whether that framework will be formally presented. But I think U.S. Special Envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are in Doha right now, and I'm sure that will be one of the issues that the Prime Minister, I think they probably maybe finished the meeting at this point, raised with the two of them to try to get the Gulf perspective out there. But on the Trump threats, I do want to point out that there were people taking this to the streets, and then the President of the United States urged them to do so and to take over their institutions. And after that, we saw, if there weren't people killed before, thousands were after at that point. And I think maybe it will be moot if there is a strike in the end. But if not, this is much more serious than a red line that Obama didn't hold, because all those people listened to the president and took to the streets and lost their lives. So I think there is a real feeling of abandonment if the U.S. doesn't deliver moving forward.
I think, by the way, I just want to reinforce what Jacob just said. We know that I mean, when I say we know, just take my word for it. We know that there were expectations built up on the street in Iran. The Iranians saw this as a kind of promise to come and intervene. And there was an expectation not only of intervention, but that the intervention would be decisive and that would end this regime. And this regime now, I think it's fair to say, is probably hated by about 80% of the population within Iran. So this is not, those who would equate it to the red line, I think the way Jacob described it is correct. President Obama not acting on the red line became it fed a perception of the United States that you really couldn't count on anything the United States said. And this is much worse because of the numbers of people who almost immediately lost their lives because of it. Think about it from both angles. They were emboldened to come out because they had higher expectations. The regimes basically at that point gave full authorization, just kill as many as you can, because they felt they were at stake at the moment. So, if you're gonna use that kind of language, you have to follow through. And even if there's a gap in time, not to follow through. Well, it's true, I think what Jacob said about the visiting Saudi official probably made a more nuanced statement than was reported. But the fact is, there was something that he said that was also reflecting that there's a consequence to, after you build up all this and your language is really bellicose as well, and then you don't act. you know, that's going to be felt.
And I think President Trump has made such a point of presenting himself as the antidote to Obama on these kinds of issues. So it's really hard to fathom them not taking some step, but it's to because he wants these one very quick solutions. And this is not the same dynamic as the 12-day war. It's a lot more difficult to find what that simple answer will be.
By the way, the reason you saw the Iranians acting in a pretty aggressive, provocative way, sending drones near our ships, looking like they were prepared to try to seize a tanker. This was their way of saying, we're not going to be cowed and we're prepared to fight you. So don't think this is going to be one and done. They talk about that by if you read what they're saying Trump doesn't want long wars.
Mhm.
So this is their way of trying to signal that, okay, the very thing you say you don't want, you're going to produce.
Thank you. And for both of you, in the event of any strikes, or given what you've just said, perhaps the likelihood of strikes against Iran, what do you expect in terms of retaliation? Is Israel in particular ready to defend against another barrage of ballistic missiles? And how likely are strikes against US forces and interests in the region, especially if the regime feels like its back is against the wall and it has nothing left to lose?
I'll say two things. One, Israel has a new defense doctrine. It's called no surprises. That's the effect of October 7th. So even though what Jacob has been told is right, I've heard it too, that we won't be we're not looking to strike, but obviously we'll respond if we are. How you square that with no surprises? If you think that once we hit them, they're going to retaliate directly against Israel, is Israel really going to wait to be hit? I'm not so sure. As for the Iranians, they will want to prove to Trump this is not going to be one and done. And you can't produce one and done. I can't send that message if once again you do something that's really limited. Now, on the other hand, if you do something that's broad-based and you're attacking a lot of targets and Americans get killed, then you're almost guaranteeing that Trump has to go on. So even the Iranians themselves are also caught in a trap because they understand the longer this goes on, they are extremely vulnerable. They still have no air defense. Israel had complete mastery of the air, and it will be the case once again for the US and to the extent that Israel's taking part. So what the Iranians have to lose is a great deal. We also have to define, okay, how does this end? I said earlier, we don't know what the objective is. If the objective is we just want to make a point to show that if you kill your people like this, you pay a price, okay, that's one thing. And then you could say we made our point, and then you can still end it. If the objective is the degradation of the regime, then you say we weakened them enough. But they may be left with the last word then, which kind of erodes, your message. If it's regime change, you can't produce it. Let's say you kill the supreme leader, which is, Trump has just said the supreme leader should be very worried. And then what? Is this the equivalent of Venezuela? We didn't change the regime there. We have the exact same regime. Yeah, we're doing business with that regime. What do we expect here?
I think when it comes to predicting, I'm going to try to avoid that a little bit. What I can say is I spoke with an Arab intelligence official who said that if Iran is feeling that the U.S. Response or attack is existential to it, then it will respond in kind and basically be willing to take steps that are more drastic and even suicidal because they feel that they have no other choice. Whereas if it's something similar to the 12-day war, as bad as it was for Iran, that's something they're willing to swallow and carry out attacks where even if they carry them out, according to President Trump, they're letting the U.S. know in advance, which sounded kind of similar to the story you were telling at the beginning, Dennis. But so I think it'll depend on the nature of the Iran strike, but it is noteworthy that last month, when there was buildup of an assumption that there was going to be a U.S. strike, one of the people that reached out to President Trump to caution against it. This is something that was reported elsewhere, but I confirmed it on my end, which was that Prime Minister Netanyahu said we're not ready for you to carry out this strike. If you think about what's been happening over the past couple of years, that these Houthi missiles that have been launched at Israel from Yemen, sometimes on a daily basis, I think they're oftentimes very much dismissed by Israelis and in the press as just a nuisance, but they did take up a lot of Israel's, I think, ballistic missile interceptors that make it harder for Israel to then be able to respond if a major attack comes from Iran now. So I think getting more U.S. assets to the region was important because Israel wasn't at that point, the understanding, really prepared and had enough interceptors to be able to handle an Iranian attack. The hope, I assume, if Israel is now again urging one now, is that therefore they're currently more prepared.
Okay, moving quickly to Gaza. For both of you, how likely do you think a renewed IDF ground incursion is into the Hamas-controlled area of Gaza known as the Red Zone? And I'm curious how the Israeli elections coming up sometime this year might influence the prime minister to either resume or refrain from such operations.
I guess I'll start. I think it's going to be very much influenced by Trump. Let's say Trump has given a deadline. I don't know that he has, but let's say he's given a deadline on the issue of disarmament decommissioning. And it may be a deadline not to complete it, but a deadline to at least begin it in a way that gives it some credibility. I know on the Israeli side, and I'm sure Jacob has heard this, there's a deep, not just deep skepticism, but a deep fear that Hamas will put on a show. It'll be a sham. It won't be real. It'll be there for the television cameras to say, see, we're doing it, but it'll be designed to not do disarmament, but a way to avoid it. As long as the Trump administration doesn't take it seriously, that's one thing. If it takes it seriously, there's no prospect that I think Bibi goes ahead and authorizes military acts. You have to deal with the fact there's a difference here in the administration side, and this I know because I've heard it directly. There is a high degree of optimism about this process unfolding peacefully, and that you'll be able to expand the green zone peacefully. On the Israeli side, there is none. There is an expectation that the only way you'll expand the green zone is through military action, and that the IDF is prepared and has been preparing to deal with that. Now, I don't think that Bibi, in the context of the elections, wants a full-scale resumption of the war, because it also means you're calling up reserves again in a way that has its own political consequence, especially at a time when we don't know what the fate necessarily is of the military draft law, which, if it turns out he is able to push that through, and then you have a resumption and all the reserves are called up, but of course none of the Haredi are, that's a real political problem for him. So I think this is complicated, but the expectation on the Israeli side is you will not see an expansion of the green zone, and you won't see any serious disarmament without Israeli military action. That's not where the Trump administration is at this point. Trump might turn around, because after all, what has he said? It would be horrible, horrible, I'm quoting, for Hamas if they don't disarm, signaling that he'll give the Israelis the green light to go ahead.
Yeah, I think, well, I know that the Israelis have passed along to the mediators that they've put together plans for a military operation in March. That's what I heard last month. It's basically a threat to try to urge Hamas to disarm. but I agree with Dennis that it's going to depend on Trump's willingness to go along with that. I think he's trying to present himself as someone who brought peace to the Middle East for the first time in thousands of years, and that therefore allowing the Gaza war to restart is going to be a hard sell, I think, on his part. I think Israel will try to frame it as something, it's a more limited operation that's only focused on maybe Gaza City. That's what I was told. What they've drafted up is what we'll look at, not all of Gaza. And maybe you won't need to call up that many reserves to do it. Maybe you can mainly focus on the active duty soldiers to take part in that. But yes, I think elections are going to play a role in that. And I think an Israeli society that's in a constant state of war is a hard thing for Netanyahu to be able to campaign on. So I think there's a lot of balls that he's going to be trying to juggle while still trying to present this present as if he's this tough on security and strong against Hamas. I think the disarmament issue, listening to the top people in the administration who are dealing with this issue, briefing reporters over the past few weeks, yes, there's this optimism, this assumption that Hamas is just going to be willing to do so, and it makes me think that Hamas just has to put on a show a little bit of maybe handing over some of the major heavy weaponry. And I think that will be enough to buy some time because I don't think it's inherently they're not in their interest to do more than that. I think there will be some degree of pressure from the mediators to play along, but I think there was a little bit more momentum earlier on or last year in the fall, right after the deal was made, when I think there was more pressure from across the board from Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey, and others in the region that wanted Hamas to end the war. And maybe even then, if you moved right away from that to this talks on disarmament, instead, the U.S. has dragged this out for months, and there hasn't even been a formal proposal made to Hamas about what disarmament would look like. There's talk in these briefings that I've been on about an amnesty program for those who give up their weapons, a buyback program. Basically, either you're going to either get money or a job in exchange for handing over your weapons. But the actual proposal hasn't been submitted to Hamas, and I think maybe there's an understanding that they want to wait until the NCAG gets into Gaza. It'll be part of a package that they're helping to chaperone. But again, this stuff takes a lot of time, and I think you've lost a lot of momentum that I think was badly needed to push this through.
Thank you. Thank you. We're almost out of time, but a quick closing question. What is one development that you are cautiously optimistic about as you look ahead?
Well, I am cautiously optimistic about the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, because I think these people actually want to do something real. And if they succeed, it begins to change the narrative about Palestinians. I've often said about Palestinians, are they victims? Absolutely. But being victims is a condition. It's not a strategy. And Palestinians and the national movement made being a victim a strategy, which guaranteed they would always be victims. If you're coming in with a mindset that is much like the mindset that Salam Fayyad had, which was, for us to have a state, we have to prove we can build one. And having Palestinians assume agency is a very big potential change in the character of this conflict. Look, we're at a point that is it from a standpoint of the political psychology on both sides, the gaps between Israelis and Palestinians is back to the equivalent of 1948. It's existential. But if you begin to have Palestinians who in Gaza begin to demonstrate that they're serious about transforming Gaza, and this is about building up themselves, and unlike Hamas, making everything about resisting Israel, fighting Israel, destroying Israel, then you're beginning to move in a direction. It may not be peace for the first times in thousands of years, but it at least gives you a pathway that's quite different at a time when we need it. You can't change the psychology without doing things practically from the ground up. Doesn't mean you don't need a political horizon. By the way, if you're going to, after the Israeli election, assuming you have a government that does not have Ben Gvir and Smotrich in it, then Israel needs to show what it's for, not just what it's against. That's the only way it can begin to really change its image. I conclude with this. We're dealing in a world where there's two different realities as it relates to Gaza. In Israel, Gaza was hostages and dead Israeli soldiers. That's the only thing that Israelis saw. The rest of the world, the only thing they saw were 70,000 dead Palestinians, certainly at least half being non-Hamas and maybe women and children. So that's what they saw. And that, especially for the younger demographic in this country, that's the Israeli brand now. And that has to be changed. And you can't change it unless you have a positive program that you're identifying with. You have to get back to rebranding Israel. Maybe next time, we can talk about that. I have a lot of ideas about how you can have rebranding, but you're not going to rebrand Israel before the Israeli election.
So I would admit I'm not a huge optimist, but I think there is a different dynamic that I've noticed from the Palestinian Authority that's been since this new Trump administration. If you recall, the first term, they cut ties after Trump recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital in 2019, I think, or even earlier. But basically, there is a shift to try to be seen as useful to the Trump administration. And we saw that with the passing of the UN Security Council resolution, where I don't think it would have passed without the PA urging and giving the sign off to Arab countries the Arab one country on the council, but also just the Arab group in general and in the region, that this was okay for them to do. I think that is a very different approach from the first time, where there was complete disengagement and frustration with the administration. Now there's willingness to be useful and take steps that maybe domestically unpopular, like with the announcement of the prisoner payments reform. There's been hiccups in the implementation, but at least it's the stated goal is to stop that policy. And that allows for, I think, it gives the Trump administration more tools to work with to try to advance this 20-point plan. Whereas if the PA became hostile, I think it would be much more difficult. Just like one issue, for example, is this issue of land registration in Gaza. When you're trying to rebuild these major projects that are happening, like in Rafah, for example, where you're going to be putting up even if it's temporary housing, it's located on land that belongs to people, and you need to be able to first, if you're the PA, expropriate that land and compensate those landowners in order to then move forward with this project. And there's going to be lots of that kind of this legalese dynamic going on in order to move forward with some of these reconstruction ideas that Jared Kushner has. And that requires the PA's cooperation, and they have been willing to play ball on that. And I think, at least for now, it seems like they're willing to continue to do so. I think, though, they're hampered by Israel withholding several $billion in its tax revenues, which basically makes it impossible for it to function. And that's not likely to change until the election because of how hot button of an issue it is. But at least you have some willingness in Ramallah to still move forward and not cut ties with the U.S. That would make this a lot more difficult to advance their plans.
Excellent. Well, with that, I'd like to thank Jacob and Ambassador Ross for participating. And now I'm pleased to turn it over to DMFI President and CEO Brian Romick for closing remarks.
Sorry. Thank you, Rachel. I want to thank Ambassador Ross and Jacob for joining us today. Their insights were clarifying and insightful. As the new year begins, there's no shortage of critical developments affecting our key priorities. With tensions escalating with Iran and some progress on the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, the stakes couldn't be higher. And on the domestic front, the midterm election cycle is already underway. Our separate sister organization, DMFI PAC, has endorsed former Lieutenant Governor Tahisha Wei in tonight's special election in New Jersey 11. Democratic Majority for Israel will continue to engage aggressively, strategically, and effectively, educating policymakers, strengthening pro-Israel leaders within the Democratic Party, and ensuring that support for a strong U.S.-Israel relationship remains bipartisan and durable. Along with the board and the staff, we are seeking to grow DMFI to meet this important, challenging time. We need your help to do this work. DMFI is supported entirely by generous individual donors. Your gift to DMFI will help us meet the challenges before us as well as the ones to come. You can scan the QR code on your screen and go to dmfi.org to make a gift. Thank you in advance, and I hope to see you again on the next webinar.